Turn in your Bibles to Mark chapter 6. Mark chapter 6, we're going to be reading verses 45 through 52. And then I'd like you to place a marker in Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 through 33. Today I'm going to be reading from the God's Word translation. And the title of today's message is Train Your Senses. Train Your Senses. Or if you prefer, you can put it down as sensitivity training. Christina told me I wasn't allowed to use that title, but I really like it. So write down whichever one you want. Train your senses or sensitivity training. Have any of you ever read the comic book or seen the movie Daredevil? Raise your hand if you've seen that. So Daredevil is a story about an attorney named Matt Murdock. And this guy wears a costume and runs around fighting crime. Now, we've all seen stories about guys who wear costumes and run around fighting crime. That in and of itself makes a story. But there's something special about Mr. Murdock that makes him even more of a hero. He is blind. Can you imagine running around fighting crime as a blind man? I can't imagine doing much of anything as a blind man. And this guy's running around beating up criminals, getting in fist fights. It's awesome. Now, before you decide that you want to go home and watch this movie with your family this afternoon, I want to give you some advice. Don't. Because this week, I actually watched part of this movie to make sure I had my facts straight, and it very well may be the worst movie that has ever been made. But the story is still good. And there's one scene in the movie that, however corny, makes every kid who sees it wish just a little bit that they were blind. Because the daredevil is standing on the roof of a building with his lady friend. And he's explaining to her his feelings and how much he loves her, but how sad he is that he can't see her. And he's taking his hands and caressing her face so that he can get the shape of her face and have some sense of what she looks like. And then it starts raining. And in the rain, the daredevil uses his supersonic hearing abilities as a form of sonar, and is able for the first time to see what his lady friend looks like. It's so romantic and so sweet. He, of course, thinks that she's beautiful, and they kiss and they live happily ever after. Raise your hand if you wish you could do that. Not the kissing and living happily ever after, but if you wish that you could see with your ears. Nobody? Maybe I'm just weird. Well, that's what I want to encourage you to do today, even if you don't want to. Here's the thing. I don't think that there's anyone who has ever lived who can actually see with his or her ears. But I have read research that suggests that when a person loses one or more of their senses, that their other senses sometimes are heightened to make up for it. And I think that even without being blind, we are able to simulate that phenomenon. I think that sometimes we are able to heighten one of our senses by ignoring the stimuli that come to our other senses. Let me give you an example. Have you ever been in a situation where somebody near you was having a private conversation, and you wanted to know what they were saying, but you weren't part of that conversation, and they weren't being polite enough to speak loudly enough for you to hear them clearly? What do you do instinctively when you want to eavesdrop on that person? You either close your eyes, or you just kind of stare off into the distance and don't focus on what your eyes are getting, so you focus on your ears, and you're like, I want to hear, what are they saying about me? Raise your hand if you've done that. I did it yesterday. I did it at a graduation yesterday. They weren't talking about me. Or have you ever been straining to see something far away or read something very small, and you're really focused on what your eyes are gathering, and then you realize that your wife has been talking to you the whole time and you haven't heard a word she said? I think we've all been there. Now, Megan Perry is an eye doctor. She went to school for a long, long time to become a doctor. And she could probably tell us about the science that is happening behind the phenomenon that I'm talking about. She could probably tell us what's taking place in our brains. Or she may tell us, if we asked her, which we're not going to, that I am crazy and there is no scientific support for what I'm saying. But Megan doesn't have the microphone this morning, I do. So for the sake of this morning's message, we're going to assume that I'm right and that we can all be daredevils. It's with that thought in mind that I want us to turn to the Word. Mark chapter 6, verses 45 through 52. It says, Jesus quickly made his disciples get into a boat and crossed to Bethsaida ahead of him while he sent the people away. After saying goodbye to them, he went up to a mountain to pray. When evening came, the boat was in the middle of the sea, and he was alone on the land. Jesus saw that they were in a lot of trouble as they rowed, because they were going against the wind. Between 3 and 6 o'clock in the morning, he came to them. He was walking on the sea. He wanted to pass by them. When they saw him walking on the sea, they thought, "It's a ghost," and they began to scream. All of them saw him and were terrified. Immediately, he said, "Calm down. It's me. Don't be afraid." He got into the boat with them, and the wind stopped blowing. The disciples were astounded. They didn't understand what had happened with the loaves of bread. Instead, their minds were closed. That's a cool story, isn't it? Jesus walks on the water. Man, I wish I could have seen that. Christina and I were in Oklahoma City this weekend, and we went to the Oklahoma City bombing memorial. And they have what do they call those? An infinity pool there. You know, it's like water about that thick on concrete. And for half a second, I thought, man, if they had one of these at somewhere that wasn't a solemn place, I could pretend I'm walking on water. Jesus is the only guy that's ever done that, right? Well, if this is the only account of the story that you read, that's what you would believe. But thankfully, Matthew also wrote about this account. And I want us to look at what Matthew wrote and compare it to what Mark wrote. So Mark wrote, Jesus quickly made his disciples get into a boat and crossed to Bethsaida ahead of him while he sent the people away. Matthew wrote, Jesus quickly made his disciples get into a boat and cross to the other side ahead of him while he sent the people away. Mark said after saying goodbye to them, he went up to the mountain to pray. Matthew said after sending the people away, he went up a mountain to pray by himself. Mark said when evening came, the boat was in the middle of the sea, and he was alone on the land. Matthew said when evening came, he was there alone. The boat was now hundreds of yards from the shore. Mark said Jesus saw that they were in a lot of trouble as they rowed because they were going against the wind. And Matthew said that they were being thrown around by the waves because it was going against the wind. Mark said between 3 and 6 o'clock in the morning, he came to them. He was walking on the sea. He wanted to pass by them. Matthew said between 3 and 6 o'clock in the morning, he came to them. He was walking on the sea. Mark said when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it's a ghost and began to scream. Matthew said when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified. They said it's a ghost and began to scream because they were afraid. Mark said immediately, he said, calm down, it's me, don't be afraid. And Matthew said immediately, Jesus said, calm down, it's me, don't be afraid. Same story, right? Almost word for word, same story. But the next thing Mark says is he got into the boat with them, and the wind stopped blowing. The disciples were astounded. But the next thing Matthew says is Peter answered, Lord, if it is you, order me to come to you on the water. Jesus said, come. So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water toward Jesus. But when he noticed how strong the wind was, he became afraid and started to sink. He shouted, Lord, save me. Immediately, Jesus reached out, caught hold of him, and said, you have so little faith, why did you doubt? When they got into the boat, the wind stopped blowing. The men in the boat bowed down in front of Jesus and said, you are truly the Son of God. So wait a minute, this is the exact same story. But Mark completely leaves out the entire part about Peter getting out of the boat and walking on the water. Now, if you didn't know anything about Mark, what you would think is maybe he was jealous of Peter, so he left that out. Or maybe he just didn't remember it the same way that Matthew did. Let me explain something. Mark actually doesn't remember it at all because Mark wasn't there. See, Mark wasn't a disciple. Mark was an evangelist that came later. But do you know who Mark's best friend was? Peter. Many scholars believe that Mark wrote his gospel from the first-hand accounts given to him by Peter. That just like Christina and I do when we go listen to Glenn Rogers tell his stories, that night after night, John, Mark, and Peter were hanging out, and Peter would tell story after story after story of what Jesus had done. That Mark served as the scribe, but that Peter was the source. But if that's true, then why would Peter leave out this part about him walking on the water? It's kind of crazy, right? Like, I mean, I haven't done much with my life. I've done some cool stuff. And most of it you already know about because I tell you. If I do something cool, I'm going to let people know. If I walked on water, you better believe you would know. You'd be like, man, I hope I don't run into Brian today. He's just going to talk about walking on the water again. But Mark left this out of his gospel. Was Peter being humble? Was it an act of humility and he just didn't want the focus to be on himself? After all, there's many things that other authors record about Peter that aren't recorded in Mark's gospel. Or maybe it's because the story doesn't end as awesomely as it begins. Like maybe Peter's like, well, I could tell him I walked on the water, then I'd have to tell him I almost drowned. I'll tell you what I think it is. I think that he knew that it wasn't what he did that was important, but it was what Jesus did. I think that Mark may have thought if we include this part about Peter, it's going to distract from the meaning that was supposed to be communicated by what happened on the boat. Because you see, Mark writes something most likely upon the instruction of Peter that none of the other authors include. Here's what he says in verse 51. The disciples were astounded. And then in verse 52, they didn't understand what had happened with the loaves of bread. Have you ever met someone with bad ADD? The other day, I was actually in a conversation with someone, and I had told this person that winning at the game of rock, paper, scissors is an easy thing to do. That you don't play the game, you play the person. And this individual didn't believe me, so they said, how? How do you win at rock, paper, scissors? Since they asked, I decided to explain. So I got out my graphs and my charts and my illustrations and started drawing and explaining to this person how you win at rock, paper, scissors. And I was about 28 seconds into my explanation, And this person said, boy, these candies sure are good. I remember I was like, well, excuse me for bothering you with the answer to the question that you asked me. I apologize for boring you. I'm not going to tell you who that was. She can tell you if she wants. But doesn't that seem like that's what happened with Mark here? He's like, Mark's writing, and he's like, all right, here we go. The storm, there's waves. Jesus walks on the water, calms the storm. You know, oh, the disciples didn't understand the bread. What? Squirrel. It actually makes someone like me want to dig into that bread statement. Be like, what was Mark thinking there? I should have entitled this sermon, Soggy Bread. Here's the thing, I'm not going to make you read with me, but I want to explain to you what Mark was doing there. Because Mark didn't have ADD. Well, he may have, but that's not what caused this. See, immediately before the storm incident, what happens is we read that John the Baptist, who was Jesus' cousin, was beheaded. He was in prison, and they cut off his head. And John the Baptist's disciples come to Jesus, and they tell him what has happened. And so naturally, he's sad. And he tells his disciples, let's go away where we can be somewhere alone. He wants to go mourn. But the Bible says that when they got in the boat and they started heading off to a private place, that the people saw them. And so they ran on ahead. They basically ran around the lake. And it says that when they got to the other side in the boat, there was a huge crowd of people there. And this huge crowd of people was there. And the Bible tells us that Jesus felt sorry for them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he spent time teaching them. So Jesus spends this time teaching the people. But then it gets to be dinner time. And there's nowhere to eat. Because they went out to the middle of nowhere to be alone. So they're out in the middle of nowhere with 5,000 men plus the women and children. Jesus tells his disciples, the disciples come to Jesus and they say, Jesus, you need to send the people away. Tell them to go to the farms and the villages and get themselves some food. And Jesus says, no, you feed them. And they look at Jesus and they're like, wait a minute, it would cost a year's worth of our wages to feed all these people. Besides that, there's not that much food around. So Jesus takes 5 loaves and 2 fishes and feeds 5,000 men plus the women and children. When he's done, it says that he quickly tells the disciples to get into the boat and he sends them away. And that's what brings us to our text. Jesus sends them away, and then he says goodbye to the people, and then finally he gets to go up to the mountain to be alone and mourn. The storm happens. Jesus walks on the water. Peter walks on the water. Jesus calms the storm. And at the end of recounting this story, Mark says they didn't understand what had happened with the loaves of bread. I wonder what Mark meant. I mean, there's a few things he could have meant. He could have meant that they didn't understand the level of compassion that Jesus has for people. Maybe they didn't get that he cares about us so much. That he sees us in our times of trouble and that he wants to help. Or maybe he meant that they didn't understand Jesus' power. Maybe they didn't get that the same power that Jesus used to break the bread and feed 5,000 people with a sack lunch, many more than 5,000 men plus the women and children, that same power he used was power that could calm a storm. I think it's both and then some. I think that what the disciples didn't understand and what Mark was trying to communicate was that when you add the love that Jesus has for us to his unending power, that we should never worry about anything. Because he loves us so much and he has the power to fix whatever situation we're facing. It's funny to me that Jesus knew that the disciples didn't get it. We know this because Jesus decided to show them again. If you go to Mark chapter 8, verses 1 and 2, it says, "About that time there was once again a large crowd with nothing to eat. Jesus called his disciples and said to them, 'I feel sorry for the people. They have been with me for 3 days now and have nothing to eat.'" You know what I find amusing here? The disciples' response. If it had been me, and less than a week ago, I saw thousands of hungry people that Jesus took a sack lunch and fed them, and now here I am looking at thousands of hungry people, do you know what my initial response would be? Hey, Jesus, that thing that you did, why don't you do that thing again? You remember that thing? Do that thing. But here's what happens in Mark 8:4. It says that this time there's 4,000 people, 4,000 men plus women and children. Jesus says, hey, feed these people. I feel sorry for them. And here's what the disciples say. Where could anyone get enough bread to feed these people in a place where no one lives? Where could anyone get that much bread, Jesus? Are you kidding me? How dense are these guys? I mean, I don't mean to be disrespectful, but they were not intelligent. Or they at least weren't perceptive. No wonder Jesus is always griping at them for their lack of faith. If I was looking at these people, I'd be like, Jesus, do that again. Instead, these guys are saying, Jesus, there's no way. There's just no way to feed all these people. All we have is 7 loaves and a few fish. Last time they had 5 loaves and 2 fish. This time all we have is 7 loaves and a few fish to feed less people than you did last time. Aren't you glad that you're not as dense as the disciples were? Aren't you glad that when we're sick and we need healing, and we know that Jesus has healed us time and time again, aren't you glad that we don't worry about our health because we know he's got it? Aren't you glad that when our finances are all but gone, when we know that we don't make enough money and we got to pay the mortgage and we don't know how we're going to do it, but we know God's come through time and time again, aren't you glad that we don't worry about it? That we know he's in control? Aren't you glad that we're not like the disciples who clearly don't understand that Jesus has the power to change our situation and loves us enough to do so? Aren't you glad we're not like them? Let me tell you what's really sad about these disciples. They watched Jesus feed the 5,000, but they didn't learn the lesson. Because just a few hours later, they were in a storm, and they didn't believe, they were scared. So then Jesus knows they didn't get it, so he does it again. They watch him feed the 4,000, and you're like, well, surely they got it now. Surely they have figured it out. And then you get to Mark 8, verses 14 through 21. And you find out that the disciples are on a boat. and they forgot to bring food with them. It says they forgot to bring any food, so they only had one loaf left. And do you know what the disciples are doing on the boat with one loaf of bread? They're arguing about only having one loaf of bread. They're fighting and probably saying, well, no, Peter, it was your job to bring the bread. And Peter's like, I don't think so, Matthew. It's your turn. I saw you had the bread. They're arguing about it. And in verses 17 through 21 of Mark chapter 8, here's what it says. It says, Jesus knew what they were saying, and he asked them, why are you discussing the fact that you don't have any bread? Don't you understand yet? Don't you catch on? Are your minds closed? Are you blind and deaf? Don't you remember? He says, when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets did you fill with leftover pieces? They said 12. And he says, when I broke the 7 loaves for 4,000 people, how many large baskets did you fill with leftover pieces? They said 7. It says, and he asked them, don't you catch on yet? Don't you ever get it? Will you ever understand who I am and what I can do? Aren't you glad we're not like the disciples? Or are we? See, Mark left out the part about Peter walking on the water to Jesus. But I'm glad that Matthew didn't leave it out. Because it illustrates perfectly what the disciples' problem really was. Jesus tells Peter, come on out to the water, it's me. And when Peter hears the Lord, he gets out of the boat and he starts walking towards him. But then it says, Peter sees how strong the wind is, and he gets scared and begins to sink. When he hears the Lord, he has faith and he marches forward. He's walking on the water. But when he sees his circumstances, he begins to sink. Church, we need to train our senses. We need to stop worrying about what we see around us. Stop worrying about our circumstances and how big the wind is and how big the waves are and how big the storm is. Let's not focus on what we see. Let's focus on what we hear. Let's focus on God telling us it's going to be all right. So many times in our lives, we hear the Lord's voice and we step out of the boat. But when we see how big the wind is, we start to sink. When we see our bank account, our faith gets shaky. That next step, our ankle's in the water. When we see our marriage, how we're not getting along, we start to sink. When we see our sickness and we don't know why we're not getting any better, we start to sink. When we see the ministry that God has called us to do and how it's not as big as we thought it would be, or it's not as great as we thought it would be, or it's not successful as we thought it would be, we start to sink a little bit more, a little bit more, and a little bit more. When we see that we're still sinning after we're supposed to be saved. When we see that God delivered us from an addiction to drugs or alcohol, but that bottle is calling our name. We sink a little bit more. When we see how strong the wind is, we get scared and we start to sink. Church, what we need to do is we need to train our senses. We need to stop worrying about what we see, and we need to focus on hearing God when he says, I will never leave you. I will never forsake you. When he says, I'm going to be with you until the end of time. When he says, greater is the spirit that's inside of you than that spirit that's trying to destroy you. If we could only train our senses to focus on God's promises. Church, I know that there are people here today who God has given you a promise at some point in your past. Maybe it's a promise from Scripture that's clear and it's a promise to every Christian, or maybe it's a promise that was given specifically to you. But you're having trouble hearing that promise because you're seeing your circumstance. I want to tell you one last thing, and then we're going to pray. It says Jesus went up on the mountain and he sent the disciples away in the boat. I heard someone talking about this passage the other day, someone who had been to Israel, and they got to go on that mountain. They got to go up on that hill where Jesus sat to mourn over John. And they said they looked out to this direction and they could see the water all the way across to the land on the other side. Jesus went up on this mountain. He sent the disciples away in the water. And for several hours, he saw them fight the wind, fight the waves, try to make their way. Whatever you're going through right now, Jesus sees your situation. And we don't know why he decided to take so long. Maybe he was trying to build their faith. Maybe he was trying to give them the opportunity to trust in him. But one thing we do see about the disciples is pretty cool, is they didn't give up. Man, if it had been me and you're rowing for hours, and it says literally they were several hundred yards from the bank. Rowing for hours and you're only several hundred yards away? If it's me, I'm like, let's go back. But they didn't give up. They kept doing what the last thing Jesus told them to do was. So if you're not seeing the results yet of your promise, I want to challenge you, keep doing what the last thing is that Jesus told you to do. Maybe that's trusting in him. Maybe that's serving in a position. Maybe that's paying your tithes. Maybe that's just putting one foot in front of the other every day.